We good?
Yeah, I hope so.
Welcome, welcome to
Sorry,
another week on the.
I was sorry, I was talking over you. All right,
Welcome
let's
to
do it this
another week.
time.
Welcome to another week on the D3 Datacast. We're through the opening weekend of tournament play. I'm Zach Snyder, joined as always by Matt Snyder. Matt, was there anything in particular that jumped out to you as you watched the start of the tournament Friday and then into Saturday for the second round?
I think it was a great opening weekend. The thing, if I'm honest, that surprised me the most was maybe the lack of upsets. We had a lot of good games, we had a few upsets. I was expecting some major mayhem, and we didn't really get major mayhem. We had a lot of good games. We had a lot of maybe almost major mayhem. The biggest one in my mind was Farmingdale State against Christopher Newport. Farmingdale State led most of that game. They went toe to toe with the captains. Really, only in the last couple of minutes did that lead trade back and forth a few times. Farmingdale State had a shot at the buzzer or right around the buzzer to win that game, and it was off the rims, and Christopher Newport survived. That had a chance at being the complete like shocker that we expected. I think of the first round games that actually ended in what you might call a upset, it was NYU going down in defeat. I think that was probably the closest thing to an upset with Lancaster Bible defeating NYU. That was really the biggest game. Anything that stood out to you, Zach?
Yeah, you mentioned the lack of upsets, and of course, March Madness is also known for the buzzer beaters, the exciting finishes, and it wasn't until the very last play of the last game of the weekend that we got a made buzzer beater with Josiah Johnson hitting a three to
Oh,
beat
yeah.
East Texas Baptist by two. I feel like, unless I'm forgetting something, every other late second shot, buzzer beater attempt uh, missed. You mentioned with Farmingdale, Hope had the same thing happen. Had a great look at a shot down one against Oshkosh that rimmed out. So we almost went the entire opening weekend without that thrilling buzzer beater finish, but Josiah Johnson, with the last shot of the weekend, gets it done. I think really the big hashtag narrative coming out of the weekend, you've got to be talking about the NESCAC and the UAA, right? These between these two power conferences, two of the probably top three, maybe top three conferences in all of Division III basketball. They see a combined 9 teams get into the 64 team field. That represents 14 of the total 64 team field comes from these two conferences. And heading here into the second weekend, we've got goose egg between the two of them. Things started out great for the NESCAC, going 4-0 in the opening round, and then they turned that around by going a combined 0-4 in the second round. For the UAA though, it's a little bit of a different story. It kind of went from bad to worse, going 2-3 in round one, with those two wins being a maybe surprisingly close game between Case Western Reserve and Arcadia. And then Wash U did have a convincing win, but against a team who was under 500 in their conference and made a great run, to secure the auto bid out of the American Rivers. But you look at them losing 3 games, and then the two that they won, it's not like headline stuff. And then you turn around the next night, Case Western loses to Whitewater, and then Wash U looked good in the first half,
Yeah.
and then couldn't close the deal against North Park, which that I feel like that's really another game we got to talk about, because North Park is a team. It's nice to see them getting through to the Sweet 16, because they really, I don't think, have gotten their due. I know our friend Bob Quillman's been trying to tell everyone about North Park, and so good on him, good on them for getting through to the Sweet 16. They're a team that does not go away. Wash U handled their pressure pretty well in the first half. They had just 7 turnovers at halftime, but those Vikings do not go away. Wash U, could deal with the pressure that North Park brings for 20, maybe 25, 30 minutes, but you can't do it for 40 minutes. They turned the ball over 14 times in the second half. North Park looked really good, and got it done. So congratulations to them. It's good to see them coming through. And that clinched the 0 for 9 in terms of the NESCAC and the UAA getting through to the Sweet 16.
Yeah, I like to give those two conferences as hard of a time on social media as anyone. I think that's just kind of fun because they are two of the better conferences in Division Three. And a year ago, if I can take us back to a year ago, I made a silly Twitter post about how the WIAC was going to go 0 for 3 on the second night of the tournament and not get anyone to the Sweet 16. And that came true. And then we kind of had a little bit of fun at the WIAC's expense because they were the best conference last year. So that's just part of it is ganging up on the big guys. I think the teams that all got in from these conferences, I think it was 5 from the UAA and 4 from the NESCAC. They're all good teams. They could beat almost anyone on almost any night. But as we've talked, the storyline of the whole season has been parity, has been balance. We knew some teams were going to get through to the tournament or into deep into the tournament that aren't from these big conferences necessarily. There's a big bit of randomness in play as far as um, Emory could have beaten Hampton-Sydney and had another team in the round of 32. Case, was back and forth with Whitewater for most of that second half. Well, Whitewater had a lead, then Case kind of shrunk it down and took a lead, and then Whitewater was able to extend it. So that could have gone either way. North Park and WashU had a big lead. So it's not like there's not really a deficiency in these conferences necessarily, but it also goes to show they weren't far and away better than everyone. I think, and there was discussions, maybe rightly, about does a team like Rochester get into the tournament, and then they do, and then they lose to Nichols from a not a top tier conference. We had on our show how that game looked like a 50-50 matchup. I think we had Nichols by a half a point based on our computer line. So we expected maybe Nichols to win a tight game or that to be even matchup, and it was. That one could have gone either way. So I mean, we kid around with those conferences, but it is amazing to see them not advance past this point, almost just on the sheer number of opportunities they had with nine teams in the tournament. But it didn't happen, and it's just because I think those two conferences, I don't think they had an elite team in the field this year for the whole season. It wasn't one of the top couple of teams in the conference or in the league in Division Three, and so it just happened that a bunch of the matchups did not go their way, and I think that's fine. I think it'll be cool to see some other conferences in the Sweet 16. Not that they're all second and third tier. We have a couple of WIAC teams. We have a couple of CCIW teams in the Sweet 16. So those are kind of old standby conferences as well. But I mentioned them a couple times. Shout out to Nichols for making the Sweet 16. I think they were probably our least likely entrant into the Sweet 16 based on the computer, how they had them. Maybe UW Whitewater was second, kind of winning kind of an even matchup in the first game and then having to play the host in the second round, getting through. So shouts to those two teams. Other than that, I think there was a lot of chalk as far as teams that were kind of like 1, 2, 3, 4 seeds in their region getting through, which is also cool to see. Teams that we expected to be strong. But yeah, there's no UAA, there's no NESCACs. We're going to go through the Sweet 16. Those conferences are watching just like the rest of us.
Yeah, you mentioned the overall depth is really good in the NESCAC and the UAA, but just to kind of speak to that, so each of those conferences have 7 teams ranked in the Massey Top 100 after the most recent updates here through the second round of tournament play, but no top 10 teams according to Massey, and that's even more true in the NESCAC, which doesn't have a team in the top 20. So a lot of really good teams, a lot of teams that a collection of teams that it wouldn't have been a surprise to see a couple of the, get through to the Sweet 16, but also not a complete shock to see these two conferences shut out. So yeah, a lot of depth. Hey, you go 5, 6 deep in any other conference, you're not going to find the quality of teams that you're going to find in the UAA and the NESCAC. It just happens that, that top end talent or that top end contender just wasn't there this year.
Yep.
And right off the bat, Friday, Tufts against Widener was the first game to tip off, and it was really great. We got all these staggered starts, but just with them being the first, that was one of the games I was able to see them a lot of on Friday. And watching Tufts, they were not a surprise Pool C, not really a controversial Pool C, but watching that game, I thought you watch them play, and it didn't jump out to me that this is clearly a superior team to talk about some of the Region 7 teams that we're very familiar with that were bubble out or even maybe not even really the type of NCAA criteria resume that was going to be in the conversation, right? So like I'm watching that Tufts game, and that's not clearly a better team than Worcester. I don't think it was a better team than Calvin. I think that Trine is right there on that level. So I think that the frustration that a lot of people in the D3 hoops community that maybe are getting their jollies seeing these conferences get shut off or get shut out, a lot of the frustration comes with these leagues are the teams are able to put together the high SOS resume that it seems like the committee is deferring to, whereas it's never the winning percentage that's getting deferred to. So it just seems like there's this pool of teams of similar quality, and it's the UAA and the NESCAC teams that are going to have within that pool the type of criteria that gets them in, whereas other similarly talented teams aren't going to be ever really evaluated or considered at the same level. So I think that's where a lot of the frustration comes. All right, a couple other kind of crazy things that I wanted to note. We talked about WashU, 7 turnovers in the first half, 14 in the second. Here's my biggest stat though from the opening weekend. Randolph-Macon. All right, we know they're just a machine of a program. They can lock you down defensively. They're number one in the efficiency ratings because they have a top defense and a top offense. But just to put a fine point on just kind of what they can do defensively, over their 2 games, their opponent scored a combined 22 points in the first half. So that's how, as a top seed, you want to cruise through second halves. That's that's how you do it. A total of 22 points. It was 8 on Friday night by Wilson, and then Scranton had just 14 at halftime on Saturday.
Yeah, I think we expected that Wilson game to be lopsided just based on Randolph-Macon being kind of the top team in the tournament. I think they had something like 8 points at halftime, and at that point, I think Randolph-Macon had scored maybe more points than Wilson would have scored in the entire game. But shouts to Wilson. They were the CSAC champs. Got into the tournament. Great to see. And I think Randolph-Macon's one of those teams we might see in Fort Wayne for a second year in a row.
Matt, I want to talk about John Carroll here a little bit because I think that the computer line we had as we were looking at the first round matchups, just a 1-point favorite over Albertus Magnus. But we had noted that for whatever reason, John Carroll hasn't come out looking as good as public opinion or they have in the top 25 based on the efficiency ratings. So I was really interested to see how that game with Albertus Magnus would go. There were stretches there that I think it was clear that Albertus Magnus could play on a fairly even level with John Carroll, but over 40 minutes it diverged. Luke Chacon had 21 points in the first half, and he was really the difference. And then I think it ended up being a 9-point game. So it was still a close game, and maybe even a little bit closer than most people would have predicted. But what that set up was a really interesting one to me because we noted John Carroll has been not viewed as highly by the computer, but that set up a second round matchup with Oswego State, who's been one of the real computer darlings. So I was very interested to see how that game would go. And Oswego State did win, not quite by the computer line margin, but I think that was maybe a little bit one that's vindication for the computer.
That was Oswego State game I'm talking about with John Carroll. That was an amazingly shaped game. If you just look at the line score right now, Oswego State outscored John Carroll 30-33 in the first half, and then 33-31 in the second half. So you look at that and you're like, oh, final score was 66-61. That was a close game throughout. That was a weird game throughout. John Carroll got out to a 12-2 lead. And then Oswego State pulled all the way back and took a one possession lead at halftime. And then I think got up to like maybe a 17-point lead or something about that early in the second half. And then John Carroll kind of clawed back and made it a couple of possession game. So you just look at the line score, the quick check of the box score, and you think that was an even game. It was like a roller coaster up and down for both teams, where you didn't think Oswego was going to stay in the game because John Carroll was just lights out for the first few minutes. And then Oswego clawed back and took a huge lead. And then John Carroll came all the way back. And I don't know if that game was really ever in doubt, but it was, it got tighter toward the end. But yeah, that was an interesting one to see. I think sort of, I mean, you don't want to read too much into one game, but it was maybe sort of vindication on both sides of the computer lines. Oswego is like number 3 or number 4. I think number 4 maybe by the computer rankings. What did we say it was? Anyway, they're very high. They're top 5 for sure. And to even on their home floor, beat a John Carroll team that's, hey, they're a good team. They're potentially in the mix for the Final Four. Obviously, a big game with Randolph-Macon coming up. And then for John Carroll of, hey, much of the year, I think they were probably rated higher than Oswego State. I don't know if that's actually the case anymore right now, but it was shown that maybe they aren't quite as good of a team there. I don't want to overstate any of that, but I think that was one of my most anticipated matchups of the second day, and I think that one proved to be a doozy.
Yeah, I've been trying to think of reasons that the computer may not have liked John Carroll as much through the year, and I think some of these games might be kind of microcosms of that whole season, right? Because this is a super talented team, but then they have stretches in games where you wonder why it's not all coming together, right? Like even in that Oswego game, you've got a range where they go from up 10 early to down by as many as like 17. So we're talking about like 25 to 27 point swings within the same game, and it's like, okay, which one of these teams is right? Like you go back to the OAC tournament, you have a team capable of jumping on top of Marietta by whatever it was, but then also they're not so good that Marietta didn't come storming all the way back and win the game, right? So you just wonder, like what is the true level of this team? You look at even just total results, good enough to go on the road and win at Wheaton, but not so good where they don't drop a game against Wisconsin Superior
by double digits.
yeah, right. So I'm led to believe it's just they don't always play up to their true potential, and maybe that shows up in games that they still win that human voters wouldn't necessarily hold against them. But in sort of this computer analysis, when it's supposed to be a 15-point win and it's just a 5-point win, a human voter may overlook that a little bit more, but the computer says, hey, there's a 10-point miss here. So I don't know, who knows. But hey, still a very good turnaround season for John Carroll. Yeah. A lot of fun to watch them. But you see those stretches where they go 10-minute stretches where they look unbeatable, and then the next 10 minutes, the team comes roaring back, and you wonder, is this the same team?
Yeah, they're certainly a dynamic team, and I think they return a bunch in subsequent seasons. So it'll be interesting to see them grow as well.
Well, Matt, we have our Sweet 16. So just as we did for last week in the first round, let's get into the matchups kind of one by one, look at where they rank in terms of overall efficiency margin, break it down into how they are shaped in terms of their offensive efficiency profile, their defensively, and then tempo, and then start to look at who might be the favorites in each game. So kind of going in bracket order, we've got, the one that we've kind of had circled from the very beginning here. The favorites have made their way to the Sweet 16, setting up a huge matchup between Randolph-Macon and Oswego State. There you see both ranked in the top 3 by your computer. Randolph-Macon has been number 1 pretty much throughout here. And like we said, Oswego State's, though, been one of the computer darlings. Now, Oswego State plays a little bit faster, Randolph-Macon a little bit more deliberate, and the computer sees this one as a 61-39 matchup in terms of win probabilities, with a computer line of 3 points in Randolph-Macon's favor.
Yeah, Oswego State's, every time I look at their numbers, their efficiency numbers, it surprises me how high this is. Because I'll be honest, I don't tend to think of Oswego State, if I'm honest, among the top teams in the country. But I've had to look at computer lines to start moving them up my ballot the last several weeks of the season as a top 25 voter, because the numbers are there. And we just saw it against a team like John Carroll, who was Also a very strong team, maybe in the hosting consideration for those opening weekend games, and they took care of business. They won that pod, and I think they've proven themselves to be right up there. Now, this matchup with Randolph-Macon, that's one no one wants to see because Randolph-Macon looks, again, not quite as good as last year, but they look like the best team in Division III this year. And I think this will be an interesting one. To me, the way the numbers look, the difference might be that Randolph-Macon, when they need to, can really just turn in those screws on defense and really tighten it down. Oswego State has a good defense as well, but maybe not quite to the strength of Randolph-Macon. That could prove to be the difference. We'll have to see how that one turns out. Randolph-Macon, by the way, the number one defense in Division III by a very close, slim margin over USJ St. Joseph right now.
And Oswego State does have the efficiency, the adjusted efficiency number on the offensive side advantage here. Plus, they play at the faster pace. So I think their plan is going to have to be to speed up this game as much as possible. Hope that offensive talent can really rise and give Randolph-Macon some trouble. But this is definitely looking like the game of the weekend. You don't want to overlook anyone and say this is the true game for the Final Four, but whoever comes out of this one is going to be the favorite the following night. Now, you don't want to overlook, because look at that very next line there. Johns Hopkins ranked by the computer as number 5 team. So this is a very top heavy group here in the Sweet 16. Hopkins has Whitewater, who ranked 37th, but you have to look at what they did over the first 2 rounds. Have to be very impressed. Not discount them at all. But in terms of the overall outlook here for a Sweet 16 matchup, Hopkins is a heavy favorite as a 73-27 win probability advantage, and then a 6.5 point favorite on the computer line.
Yeah, again, I think defense could potentially be the difference here. Case Western, for example, who Whitewater had just beaten, their defense is more like a 98-ish. They're closer to average. Johns Hopkins, 84 defense here. Now, Whitewater has seen good defenses playing in the WIAC, so that shouldn't be anything new to them. But Johns Hopkins here is a based on the computer ratings, is a different level from even Case Western Reserve. Case Western Reserve is a team who the human voters have learned to like quite a bit, but the computers have them not even quite in the top 20 at this point. So again, a good team. Everyone's good at this point. Everyone can beat everyone. There's no bad teams left. But Johns Hopkins here, number 5 by the efficiency ratings. We see 3 of the top 5 teams all up in this quadrant left in the Sweet 16. So that's going to be a bloodbath here. But I would maybe myself lean a little bit towards that defense, towards Johns Hopkins. Now, we know they don't have Tom Quarry. They haven't had him for maybe 4 or 5 games now, 3 to 5 games, somewhere in there. But they've still looked like a very good team, even without him. They've gone toe-to-toe with Swarthmore in the Centennial Championship, and I think Swarthmore won that game, but I think that was a good game. Obviously, they've made it through the first 2 rounds.
Back.
Yeah, they had to come back
to do it. Hopkins had a lead on them. Yep.
Right. And obviously they've gotten through to the Sweet 16 here. So they're a good team. They were more than just Tom Quarry, even though he was one of their better players. They're a strong team, and maybe this game will be a little bit tighter since we don't have them, and this is taking a full years of data into account. But I think it's still a game that I would expect Hopkins to be advantaged.
Jumping down the bracket, we have Rowan against Oshkosh. And the really interesting thing here to note here is this is the matchup with the biggest disparity between tempos, right? Rowan is one of the fastest teams in the whole tournament and here in the Sweet 16, whereas Oshkosh plays at one of the slowest paces in the Sweet 16. So this will be a very interesting matchup, a real contrast of styles. The computer likes Oshkosh as a 2.5 point favorite. So we'll see what happens, but this is definitely going to be a team that wants to play fast versus a team who wants to slow it down a lot.
Yeah, even though Oshkosh is slow, in my estimation from watching them, I don't know that they're a team that has to be plotting. I think they play 3 guards quite often. I think Borchert's not necessarily, like, even as a forward, isn't like a lead-footed big. I think he can maybe get down the court if he needs to. So I don't know that Oshkosh is going to be a team that would be completely out overmatched or out of their element in a faster type game. I don't think that's usually how they want to play, but I think that they might have the personnel to handle that style if they need to. It'll be like you said. I love one of the things I love about the tournament is you get to see some of these contrasting styles. We saw that a little bit with WashU and North Park and saw how that ended up. Now, one of the big things is if Oshkosh isn't really used to this, you don't see it a ton in the WIAC, I don't believe. Does that how can you go through that for 40 minutes, right? We saw WashU kind of handle it pretty well for 20 minutes. Once you get to minute 30 to minute 40, then and not that Rowan is the exact same style as North Park, but just I'm talking about like a faster pace in general. Sometimes that wears on you as the game goes on, and the team that's used to playing it can kind of make up ground in the last few minutes if they need to. Definitely interested in seeing this. Again, on the defensive side, if Oshkosh can kind of counter that faster paced style and get set up on defense, is that gonna prevent Rowan's offense from working? You see Rowan having a higher rated offense than Oshkosh does, but again, seeing how those actual contrasting styles play out on the court is what makes the tournament interesting.
Which brings us to North Park. You mentioned the difficulty WashU had playing with North Park's pressure. Now they get Mount Union here in the Sweet 16. Again, over in that tempo column, 75.2, 75.4. So these teams are basically dead even in terms of tempo. No one's going to be trying to force anyone into any other kind of tempo than what they're used to be playing. Again, now styles can differ, but in terms of the overall pace of this game, it should be very familiar and very comfortable for either team. Which, maybe that takes away some of the advantage North Park has had against other teams. That they're trying to speed up or trying to put the pressure on. Mount Union seems like not the best matchup for them here.
Yeah, I've been thinking about this matchup a lot. Like you said, I think there's some similarities there between the teams. Trying to pressure and speed up any team, I think, has its advantages. Trying to turn them over. I don't know that Mount Union is. Well, obviously, have to see how it goes. I don't know if Mount Union is the team that's as susceptible to that as others might be, because I think they're okay if they need to, moving the ball down the court quickly. Neither of these teams are super fast. They're not Rowan fast. They're not, any sort of system team. But I think for North Park, it is more about pressuring the ball down the court, or anytime it's past half court. I was watching part of the WashU game, and they have their guards almost all the way out to the half court line in the front court defending WashU's guards. Just anytime they have the ball, there's some sort of pressure there and making you make a good decision, making you make a fast decision. Otherwise, they're going to force a turnover. We saw that in the second half against WashU really come to fruition. That could hit Mount Union. But I watched some of those like Mount Union versus John Carroll matchups during the year, and I don't know that this is going to be entirely different versus some of the things that we've seen there. So maybe Mount Union's used to it. And if so, the way the computers likes this game stacking up, it's two teams that are fairly even across the board, except Mount Union having a little bit more offensive firepower when they need it. And if they're used to playing against this style, or they're used to playing a little faster pace, they're used to moving the ball up the floor to get through some of that pressure. Maybe Mount Union's offense can get them to the basket enough times to stay ahead of North Park.
Right, and it may be that Mount Union's game plan to be able to deal with that defensive pressure that North Park likes to bring is to actually to speed it, to go get down the court, try to get a layup instead of just trying to survive across half court and then get into your half court. So with their normal tempo being here at a 75, it could be that, hey, let's just kick that up a little bit, try to play a little bit faster to neutralize that pressure instead of having to, break a press, break some backcourt pressure, and then only have whatever's left on the shot clock to do what we normally want to do in the half court. So if they want to play at more of like a 80 possession tempo, it's not as big of a jump when they're used to playing in the 75 range. So it'll be interesting to see how this one plays out. All right, jump into the other side of the bracket. Swarthmore is a half-point underdog to Keene State. Keene State is another team that plays a little bit faster. Swarthmore about average. But this is looking like the most even game of the weekend, at least in terms of the computer line. Keene State here is a 52% to 48% advantage on the win probability.
Yeah, for me, one of the most interesting matchups here on the Sweet 16 slate. Although I don't think Swarthmore has anything to worry about. They're on their home court. They're playing against Keene State. That hasn't been a problem for them in the NCAA tournament since last season when they lost to Keene State on their home court in the NCAA tournament. So anyway, there's going to be a lot of some feelings going on here. The Swarthmore players who had their season ended. I think it was the opening weekend last year, if memory serves, rather than the Sweet 16. But a lot of these same players played the same matchup on the same court last year. Keene State was victorious. This is going to be a great matchup, an even matchup, kind of across the board. Two teams that have similar in-range numbers here. Swarthmore a little bit more offensive firepower. Keene State a little bit better on the defense. I'm just interested to see this one.
The winner of that will take on the winner of Nichols and Stockton. Nichols, one of the darlings of the opening weekend. Now, we did have them as half-point favorites on the computer line in round one, but kind of a 50-50. And, beating a UAA in Rochester, a lot of people kind of viewed that as a little bit of an underdog win. But then getting the win over Middlebury. So add those to their credit. And here they move into the Sweet 16 against Stockton. And here you go, Nichols fans. You're no longer the underdog. You're the favorite here in the Sweet 16 against Stockton. Not by much, but a 56% on the win probability and a 2-point favorite by the computer line.
Yeah, interesting to see this matchup here in the Sweet 16, a kind of number 35 versus number 48 type team. Stockton all season was a team who the NCAA criteria liked a lot more than the computer ratings. Now, again, all good teams left. There's no bad teams and no shots at Stockton. But I think if you kind of look at the path that they had compared to some of these other teams, I think they've had not an easy path. No one's had an easy path, but they've had a winnable path, especially since they were able to play on their home court. That Mary Washington game we thought might be one of our closest games in round two, if you followed some of the tweets that we had out there. And I think it ended up being, a 3-point game or so. So it was a tight game. But a team, a host playing Mary Washington, that's probably a game that you do win, even though Mary Washington is quite good. But other than that, I just feel like Stockton, they haven't had an easy path, but they haven't had to play a John Carroll, I would say, to get to this point, like Oswego had to play. They haven't had to play a Wash U like North Park had to play to get here. So again, no shots at Stockton, no shots at Nichols, even though they're the two of the lower rated teams kind of left on this board. But that's that's how the tournament works out sometimes. A team like Nichols gets through, Stockton gets the host and gets through, and it will be another interesting matchup here.
Again, not that either team will be one for the winner of Swarthmore Keene State to overlook, but really Swarthmore Keene State matchup is the really big one here in this sectional.
It seems like it, but you never know, right?
Yep, exactly. And that brings us to the final sectional. Christopher Newport, one of those teams you noted, was able to stave off one of the biggest upset bids. Here into the Sweet 16, they come out as 7-point favorites with a 74% win probability against Mary Hardin Baylor, who did have one of the only true buzzer beater to make it here as they beat ETBU.
Yeah, Mary Hardin Baylor, I feel like their first two tournament games were sort of a summation of their season as a whole. I think you mentioned this when we were talking up about John Carroll maybe in their Oswego game. Against Schreiner. Schreiner was throwing everything at them. There were several points late in that game where I just thought Schreiner's going to do this. They were knocking down threes, whatnot. And then it feels like maybe Mary Hardin Baylor is able to flip a switch and take control of the game and toward the end and beat ETBU, that looked like more of an even matchup. We've seen them play kind of, playing in the same league. Unfortunately, we
Yeah.
had a conference matchup in the second round, so we've seen kind of the even nature of those two teams. But again, when push came to shove, Mary Hardin-Baylor found a way to get the win, and that's kind of how their season to me has gone. At the end of the day, they found a way to get the win and advance. I don't know that that bodes well when you continue to advance in a tournament if you're just kind of trying to survive teams, because the level of the teams that you play keeps getting a little bit better. Now you're going up against Christopher Newport, a team Mary Hardin-Baylor can beat. But again, if there's any stretches of the game where it looks like UMHB is on autopilot or Christopher Newport's just having their way, it's more difficult to overcome that type of a thing. Just by the numbers, it looks like Christopher Newport has the edge. But I think, up and down the line here in the Sweet 16 matchups, we're not seeing any double-digit projected margins. These are all games that are close enough that one or two possessions go a certain way, then the game can hinge on that. We're at the point Mary Hardin-Baylor's got to play 40 minutes. I think that's been one of my knocks on them. I don't know if it's fair or not, but it doesn't always look like they come out for 40 minutes and say, we are going to control this game. But I think they need to do that now if they want to advance Elite Eight, Final Four type of a position.
Yeah, they were a team that entered with big expectations, highly ranked to begin the season, and of course they lost that opening night matchup against CMS. And it just seems like the whole season we've seen flashes, but it's kind of been fits and starts here. On the season-long data, Mary Hardin-Baylor ranks 32nd overall. So it's kind of been a bit of a grind for them, but at the end of the day, here they are in the Sweet 16, and this is where they wanted to be, and they have the opportunity to keep playing for where they wanted to be all along.
For Christopher Newport, I should say as well, it hasn't been all smooth sailing. They struggled with Farmingdale State. Then the next day, they went and took care of business on Hampton-Sydney's home court, and second half controlled that game. So good to see that. But it's a game again. Sweet 16, no bad teams, all good teams. Even though this one is maybe one of the more mismatched games by the computer line, I don't think that this one is going to be a cakewalk by any stretch of the imagination. And this game is this in Hartford or is this in Newport News?
This is at Christopher Newport.
At Christopher Newport, okay.
Well, Matt, there's a reason this time of year there's a saying, survive and advance, right? So both teams, they survived and advanced. They have this week to take a breath and turn a new page, and now it's all about making that Final Four run. But it's not just about that game. There's also the matchup between Wheaton and St. Joseph in that sectional group. Now, you mentioned a lot of close computer lines here. This is the biggest number we've seen in this whole set, with Wheaton an 8.5-point underdog to St. Joseph, who's been a really solid number 2 behind Randolph-Macon in the computer rankings for the whole year. You see just a tremendous efficiency margin overall of 33.4, and if there's anyone defensively that can rival Randolph-Macon, you see it right there with the 79.1 number for St. Joseph. Now, they're just a tremendous defensive team, but you see that offensive number is pretty good too. That's how you put it all together, and you get the number 2 overall of efficiency margin of 33.4. Again, you can say what you want about their schedule through the GNAC and losing to Albertus Magnus in the GNAC championship game, but go back to what they did in that non-conference schedule. And Wheaton's the type of team they've played before and have beaten before, and now here they have a chance to do it to keep their season going.
Yeah, one interesting thing for me in this matchup, you see 2 versus 18. Doesn't seem like that big of a gap, but then we see the 8.5-point line, 78% chance for St. Joseph. Compare that up in the top quadrant, Johns Hopkins Whitewater, 5 versus 37. Seems like that's a huge gap, but only a 6.5-point line. And if you look at the efficiency margin gaps between those two teams, it's only about 10-ish points between Hopkins and Whitewater. Here it's 12 points between St. Joseph and Wheaton. All this to say, we talked about teams being bunched even in the middle. Once you get like Randolph-Macon, St. Joseph at the top, teams, the distance between ranks starts to compress. So we've seen, Wheaton's a great team. Wheaton's a good team. St. Joseph is up there like with Randolph-Macon as far as a couple of the best teams, strongest teams. So you have a 5-37 matchup that's closer than this 2-18 matchup. Not to say that this is not a game that Wheaton couldn't win. I think I think we've seen that they're good enough to beat anyone in the country. But the computers really like St. Joseph. Again, another matchup I'm interested in watching. I'm hoping, we've had the staggered starts, and we're going to continue to have that to some degree. But you can't watch all of these games, so I try to watch big chunks of them. Next Friday, I'm going to be trying to watch, as much of all of these games as I can because they all look amazing. But Wheaton St. Joseph, right up there with some of the best games that I think we're going to see. And the computer likes St. Joseph. They're an interesting team in that they have, again, one of the stronger defenses in the country. In my mind, usually when we see teams with strong defenses, they tend to play a little bit slower. St. Joseph at 74, like right on average pace. They're okay moving fast. They're okay moving slow. Wheaton's probably going to move a little bit slower. So we'll have to see, and I don't think that's going to throw St. Joseph off at all. So again, they're off two offenses, as you see on the board, rated very close to each other, but defense is probably, in my mind, going to make the difference here, and it's probably going to make Wheaton play from behind most of the game.
So that's our deep dive into the Sweet 16 matchups. Now, like we did in our bonus episode last week, we want to zoom out and to take a look at the updated tournament odds overall. Of course, now being in the Sweet 16, the zoom out isn't quite as far as we had to do when we had 64 teams left. So all the numbers you see here, if you watched our episode in which we went through championship odds last week, these are all updated to take into account the results that we saw over the first weekend. We got the updated ranks, each team's win probability for the Sweet 16 round, which you saw in the previous slide, but then zooming out to take that, take those next rounds into account, the percentage chance for each team to win in the Elite Eight, to win in the Final Four, and then ultimately to be named the national champion. And Matt, I think, people are probably going to start looking right over at that far right column to see the overall championship odds, and there's definitely two numbers that jumped out, fitting right into that discussion you had about the efficiency margin and how it's really Randolph-Macon and St. Joseph at the top, and then there's a little bit of gap before you get into some of the other, even what you want to consider elite teams. And so we see that with Randolph-Macon at the top of the bracket with 23.4% odds to win it all, and then at the far opposite end of the bracket, you have St. Joseph with a 25.7. Now, St. Joseph with the higher odds, that kind of speaks to the computer thinking they have a little bit of an easier path, slightly. We've talked about that matchup Randolph-Macon has against Oswego State, and having to draw the computer's number 3 overall team makes for a really difficult Sweet 16 game, which, in terms of how the computer views the Sweet 16 matchup, St. Joseph doesn't have. So being more likely to get through the Sweet 16 round, that is going to have a big impact on your overall championship odds. But really, those are the two numbers that really pop out, with no one else even cracking the 10% mark in terms of championship odds. If you want to look at, who the favorites are to come out of each group of 4 to be the Final Four participants, despite that tough matchup with Oswego State, Randolph-Macon is the favorite with a 45% chance based on the updated computer odds to come out of that sectional. And then really interesting, you go down to the next one. Wisconsin-Oshkosh, 32%, but Mount Union also 32%. So maybe, no clear favorite there. And then kind of similarly with Keene State at 39% and Swarthmore at 34%. We talked about the winner of that game really being the favorite going into the next game, no matter what happens. And so you see that there, not a lot separating Swarthmore and Keene State. So just, wait around. Whoever wins that game is your favorite to advance to the Final Four. And then obviously St. Joseph down at the bottom, the favorite to be in the Final Four, as they have the overwhelming championship odds there for that side of the bracket.
Yeah, you think at this point, to get to the Final Four, 25% line would be about even odds. And we see 9 teams with 25% odds or better to get to the Final Four at this point. So we have a lot of things can happen still. One thing that stood out to me when looking at the odds overall is that Oswego State's odds actually dropped a little bit after advancing 2 rounds into the tournament. I think I came up with maybe 2 reasons why that was the case. One, I think their efficiency margin maybe dropped slightly through the John Carroll game. that game we said was a little bit closer than the computer projected. So there's probably some coming back towards the middle a little bit, but also their odds. Some of that was the 15% chance that maybe Randolph-Macon didn't get to this point, that they had been beaten by, whoever their second round matchup ended up being. It was Scranton, but it could have been NC Wesleyan, right? So starting at the start of the tournament, there was some chance that it would be Oswego versus one of those other teams. Now
versus not Randolph-Macon.
Versus not Randolph-Macon. And if in that case, then their odds to advance go up significantly. Unfortunately, it's Randolph-Macon, and that maybe hampers their chance of winning this immediate game. So if they can get through, then we'll see them soar, I think. But
so you're right.
A couple percent went down for Oswego State, which is interesting.
Yeah, so you're right. I have it up. This kind of same slide that we had from or the matchup slide that we had from a week ago. Coming into the tournament, Oswego State had an overall efficiency margin of 30.8. So they fell a little bit there, but also Randolph-Macon went from an even 34 to a 34.9.
Yeah.
So that gap opened up a little bit between Randolph-Macon and Oswego State. So you're right. So not only did they not get the benefit from the matchup against not Randolph-Macon, but with the results that get added in, the gap between the two grew just a little bit.
Yeah, so through 2 games, Randolph-Macon's fractionally better than we thought they were. Oswego's fractionally worse than we thought they were, and now they actually have to play each other rather than theoretical chances of playing different teams. So that's how the odds shift that much, and interestingly, Oswego's odds go down a couple of percent.
Yeah, so like we talked about the computer lines being, nothing in double digits, a lot kind of in that 2 possession kind of game. And so with not a lot of games with much clarity in terms of the Sweet 16, that's where you see a lot of flat odds between multiple teams, just even to get to the Final Four. And then in terms of overall championship odds, at 9.8, 7.4, 3.8, kind of all the non-Randolph-Macon St. Joseph odds get kind of grouped in a everyone who has reasonable odds here left would be kind of in that 3.6 to 9.8 range.
Yeah.
Anyway, that's a kind of fancy way of saying we're going to be in for a really good second weekend. There should be a lot of good, exciting games. And I don't think that anyone should go in thinking there's a clear picture or clear favorites because even if there's some results that maybe you want to call an upset, I don't think it would also qualify as necessarily a shocking result.
Yeah. Zach, you said you had last week's slide maybe up on your screen.
Yeah. Something else you want me to...
Yeah. What was the Nichols odds to reach the Sweet 16? And what was the Whitewater odds to reach the Sweet 16? I think they were the 2 lowest to come through to this point.
So Nichols was 22%, so to reach the Sweet 16. And Whitewater was 26%. Okay. So, I mean, that sounds really low, but if you think about it, 25% is what you get by winning 2 50-50 matchups, right? So for Nichols to be 22, we talked about their matchup with Rochester being basically a 50-50, which makes them kind of just a slight underdog against Middlebury. So even at 22%, I don't think we're talking about a huge surprise that Nichols is in the Sweet 16.
That would have been about what we had expected had everyone in the whole tournament been even strength. To get through to this point, anyone would have been about 25%. All right.
So if you take those 22% odds that we saw with Nichols to reach the Sweet 16 coming through, you have of the current Sweet 16, look over at that percent to win Elite 8, you have 9 teams that are at least 22% odds. So if you want to use that as your line, kind of the minimum Sweet 16 qualifier, that leaves 9 of the Sweet 16 with at least that probability to reach the Final Four.
Yeah.
All right, Matt, that sets up a review of last week's picks.
All right, I'll run through the list here. Last week, we both took Rochester. They were minus half a point versus Nichols. Nichols won by 3. We both missed that one. The next game, I had Whitewater. You had Wabash. Whitewater was 4-point favorites, and they won by 7. I get that one. We both took Pomona Pitzer, 7.5 points. We thought the line was too big against Williams. It was not too big. Williams won by 25. We both missed that one. St. Thomas was a pick'em versus East Texas Baptist. We both went East Texas Baptist, and we both got that one. Emory was +8 at Hampton-Sydney. We both went with Emory. We won that one, even though Hampton-Sydney won. They only won by 4 points, so we thought the line was too big, and we were correct there. So going on to the summary, Zach, you were 2-3 last week. I was 3-2. You moved to 40-43 on the season. I maintain a 2-game lead, 42-37. Remember, we had one push when the Yeshiva and Farmingdale game was not played. And I think that brings us to this week's slate. And so here they are. We picked 5 games. And the first one up at the top, St. Joseph is 8.5-point favorites versus Wheaton. Zach, why don't you take a pick?
We talked about 8.5 being the biggest number here. So I'm going to go with Wheaton. I really like St. Joseph, like what they've done here, responding from their loss in the GNAC tournament championship game. But Wheaton is a veteran team, veteran guard play. I think that they'll be able to handle some of what St. Joseph does defensively. I don't know that they'll have enough to actually win the game, but I like them to keep it within 8.
Similar pick for similar reasons. I would pick St. Joseph straight up to win this game for sure, but 8.5 points feels big to me. That's what we said for the Williams-Pomona-Pitzer game, and that was not too big. But I think Wheaton will keep it within 8.5 points and make this a game to the end. Pick number 2 is UW-Oshkosh, 2.5-point favorites versus Rowan. I believe this game is at Mount Union. Zach, who do you like in this one?
Well, we talked about the difference in tempo here. I think that it's easier for a team to control the tempo when they're trying to slow it down, as opposed to forcing a team to play faster. And as you noted, Oshkosh personnel-wise doesn't have to play slow. They would seem to have some ability to play faster. So I will take Oshkosh in this one.
All right. I'm going to go Oshkosh as well, 2.5 points, neutral site. UW Oshkosh is a veteran team, and I think that they're going to win this game by 3 or more. Game number 3, Oswego State +3 points at Randolph-Macon. Zach, your pick.
Really looking forward to this one, but it's going to take a big number for me to pick against Randolph-Macon, and 3 is not a big number, so I will not pick against Randolph-Macon.
All right. I'm going to go the same as you. This one's really going to put the computer to the test with how quote-unquote close these two teams are in the efficiency ratings. I'm not saying I don't believe it, but I believe in Randolph-Macon, and I think 3 points is going to be a little bit tight here. Game number 4, Keene State at Swarthmore. Keene State's the half-point favorite on the road. Zachary, who do you like here?
I will go with SWAT. I think Keene State had a really good weekend. I think SWAT had a great weekend. The Garnet are rolling. Basically a pick'em game with a half point, so I will go with SWAT at home.
I will go against you on this one. I picked in my personal bracket Keene State to go to the Final Four. And I think, obviously they got to win this game to get there. So half a point. I'm going to take them. It's going to be a tight game, but I think Keene State can win, which means they can cover the half a point. And the final game, the 5th game on our pick slate, is North Park. The computer likes them by 3 points at Mount Union. So, Zach, how do you like this game?
Yeah, I struggled with this one. I went back and forth a little bit, but ultimately I'm going to go with Mount Union for similar reasons. Like when we talked about this matchup, I think tempo-wise, Mount Union will be fine and even has the ability, if they think it helps them deal with North Park's defensive pressure, to speed things up. They can do that pretty comfortably. So I will take the Purple Raiders.
And in the end, I'm going to agree with you as well. So we're only going to have one difference this week. I'm going to take Mount Union as well, plus 3 points. It's going to be a good game. All these are going to be good games. But I think I agree with you. I think maybe Mount Union can handle North Park's style, their defensive pressure, and I don't think it's going to get to them too much. And I think Mount Union wins the game by more than 3. That is this week's picks. Hope you're playing along. Hope you submit your picks below. If you would like us to see them, share them with others. All right, that brings us to the mailbag. Zach, do you have the mailbag question?
I do. The first one comes from Pat via YouTube. This is submitted kind of as a follow-up to Pat's question we took in the last episode. And so, there's a lot here. Let's just read it through. So on the pairwise discussion, in my opinion, there's always going to be disagreements. If the picks and brackets agreed with the efficiency ratings, they would disagree with something else. D1 tried to solve for this with net rankings, and now it seems like everyone agrees the net overrates mid-majors with mediocre quality wins somehow. So for D3, to me, the question is, what does the powers that be want to encourage or promote? Do you want people playing the hardest schedules possible and valuing that the highest? Because for various reasons, some schools can't do that, and other schools and conferences conceivably could cut their conference schedules to allow for non-conference games to boost SOS. The other factor with pairwise, in my opinion, is that a pairwise system with 350 to 400 teams is one hell of a lot different than a pairwise with 60 to 80. Even with a similar number of teams, you can have ties between them that are typically broken by strength of schedule, which, from what I'm reading, I believe that it's actually RPI, but strength of schedule is a major component, or it tends to skew to strength of schedule within RPI. How would we like seeing 3 to 4 bubble teams literally tied in ranking? I suspect not very well at all. So just to kind of further frame this from Pat, thank you for the submission, by the way. So this was there's been some discussion that maybe the NCAA would be looking at a pairwise system to implement in terms of maybe regional ranking or selection process. And so that's just a ranking method. The criteria that is underneath that, can change. And so that really comes down to, well, how do you want to define that? Currently, as it's implemented in hockey, it has 3 components, which are RPI, head-to-head results, and and then common opponents. And as noted, it's a lot easier to draw comparisons when you have a greater likelihood of head-to-head results and games against common opponents when you have a collection of 60 to 80 like is in hockey versus what we have in Division III basketball, where there's I think 419 teams in men's basketball this year. So at least as it's implemented in hockey, if you're comparing Puget Sound against Catholic, the odds of you having a lot of common opponents, let alone a head-to-head, is pretty minimal, which means basically you're coming down to a comparison just based on RPI. So anyway, hopefully that frames it a little bit better. Matt, what do you have to say?
No, I think a lot of the same things you said. I think looking at that first paragraph of the question there's always going to be disagreements, and that's true. I think the main reason is there's 20 at-large bids, 20 Pool C bids in Division III. There's more than 20 good teams or 20 deserving teams, no matter how you want to frame that. I think there's 30 to 40 easily teams that you could say make an argument for this team being good enough in whatever you want to say that, whether that's eye test or efficiency ratings or NCAA criteria, where you're splitting hairs by the end. And there's going to be no system that gets only the good teams in and leaves all the undeserving teams out, because that's just the system we have. 44 this year, automatic bids, 20 at large. There's more good teams than that in Division III, and so some teams are going to get left out, and so there's always going to be disagreements on exactly how you allocate those. For the second question, what do people want to encourage or promote? I think that's a great question. I think that gets to the main discussion we had, I think, last week when we talked about what's the underlying criteria in the system and how can we tweak those. I think the current system is better than the last system, which was the quality of wins index system. I think that system was better than the system where you just didn't have any system and you just kind of pick teams. So I think we're getting better. I think the system is generally good and trying to do the right things. I think the committees are generally good and applying those criteria well. But I think there's always room to grow and evolve the system and continue to make it better. So what do you want to evaluate? I think it's just in like winning games versus strength of schedule. I think that's even an interesting discussion because you want to promote both. We had an issue. The reason I think why, in my mind, strength of schedule has come to be valued so high is you have teams who would sit at home, play cupcakes. I said cacks because I'm thinking about the NESCAC. And that's, rightly or wrongly what I think of is let's sit at home and let's have everyone come to us and they're mid-level teams in the GNAC and we're going to beat them and we're going to go into the tournament and we're going to have 870 winning percentage or better, and we haven't played anyone. You don't want to promote that as far as a national tournament. You want to say, no, you got to go out and play someone. You got to go out and beat someone. You got to play other strong teams in your region or in adjacent regions if you can. that's a good thing to promote. We also don't want to promote a scheduling contest, as I think either Sarah Kutraki or Megan Wilson said on one of the interviews on Hoopsville or QCast or whatever they did those. This is not a scheduling contest. It's not just put up the highest strength of schedule you can and get into the tournament. You got to win those games. You got to win a lot of those games. You got to win a large majority of those games. Now, where does that line need to be? I think that's a conversation. So you have to, when you're developing criteria for at-large selections, you have to weigh both of those things, and you have to figure out a way to promote both of those things. We want teams to go out there and play other good teams. We want them to get those wins. Also, you don't want to like punish too hard for going to play a strong team and losing, but you also want to make sure that teams that are winning games are getting rewarded for that, and that those aren't just being cast aside because this team over here has put up a stronger schedule. So we do want to promote both those things. It's hard to do. I think I think I have a problem with the current strength of schedule system, and that it doesn't really measure strength of schedule in a lot of ways because it can really change based on your conference schedule. And I'm not even saying like your conference is strong or not strong, but just how many games does your conference play among itself, I think can really can swing that number toward 500 or allow you to put a higher strength of schedule together just based on the number of times you play each other. When you're playing conference schedule, like a double round robin with like a 12, 13, 14 team league, probably not a 14 team league. Anyway, you get the point. Play a double round robin. That's going to force your schedule toward 500, even if you've played really good teams in your 3, 4, 5 non-conference games. So I don't think in that way it's not really measuring how strong was your schedule, because it's your conference, by definition, someone's going to win, someone's going to lose. That's going to drag you down, even if you have a strong conference overall. So I think that's hard. I would like to see maybe if we could do something that's not just OWP, OOWP for strength of schedule. I don't know if that's going to happen or not, but I think what you're getting at here is we got to evaluate the criteria, not just throw it through a pairwise system, because if you throw the same criteria we have now through a pairwise system, we're not necessarily going to get better answers. We're just going to get more consistent answers because the computer tells us which one comes out ahead. And as Zach, I think you spoke to the idea of evaluating pairwise between like 400 teams and 60 to 80 teams. I think it could be a big difference in how it works for hockey versus basketball. I don't know the answer to that if it's better or not better. Again, if two big components are head-to-head and common opponents, and we don't really have many of those on the national scale at basketball, then you'd have to decide, is this the best system? But I think that speaks to the desire to evaluate what the underlying criteria is as kind of like your first task before you decide, do we have this committee system or this pairwise system?
There's a lot there, and I feel like the discussion is just starting. So
yeah,
there's going to be iterations on this mailbag question that riffs on topics that we've talked about before and discussions that'll keep going. So there's a little bit more. Thanks, Pat.
All right, next one.
One more mailbag here. This one came from Tony P via Twitter. Some things that we've already touched on in the episode, but Tony says, I'm really disappointed about the showings of both UAA and NESCAC teams after being told by the so-called experts how good and deserving they were to be in the tournament. Maybe this SOS and RRO stuff is overrated. Well, I think we would agree SOS and RRO stuff is overrated, but that's maybe a little bit different from trying to say whether or not the teams from the UAA and NESCAC were indeed deserving. I think my biggest thing that I mentioned earlier when we were talking about just Tufts and how they look compared to some other teams is that I think the right kind of general quality teams are getting in, but the process is looking at only a subset of a larger pool of teams that are within the same general quality.
Yeah, I think that's correct. I think whatever system is next, whenever that is, right? We don't know. Is that next year? Is that in 20 years? Whatever. It would be nice if however that worked, it expanded the number of teams that we could look at within that quality range. Like we know Barry is sort of in that quality range, and they were never in the discussion because of what their strength of schedule was. Teams like Guilford didn't get in. They're a very good team, but their metrics, as currently looked at by the criteria, were not on par, and so they didn't get selected. There were other teams in that boat as well. I think for the current system, I think I agree that RRO, results versus regionally ranked opponents, is overrated. I think what the committee is trying to do is look at good wins, quality games, and how did you do in those? And it gives them an opportunity to quote unquote look inside the numbers a little bit deeper. And I think those are good things. Where I see the problem is that we've talked about this before, but these results are baked into the winning percentage and are already baked into the strength of schedule. So we don't want to do too much, in my mind, to override those numbers with like RROs being additional resume points, right? You've already won those games, maybe you've already had that strength of schedule. So to now start jumping resumes that are on par with you just because you have more RRO, to me, that kind of it's double counting, it's maybe triple counting, and I don't like that. To me, it's a little bit heavy. SOS, I'm a big believer in strength of schedule. I'm not a big believer in the calculation of the NCAA using the OWP and the OOWP and all that's involved with that. I don't know that that's a great strength of schedule. I love the idea of a strength of schedule for reasons I talked about in the last question. Like you want to make sure teams are playing good teams. You want to encourage these good matchups out of conference in the early season. I think that's all great, but let's not be heavy-handed with it, and let's make sure that teams are actually winning some of these games, and let's have a nice balance. I want a balance. I don't want to go the other way. If we went complete pendulum swing, I think, to me, that would be worse. I don't want to see the Lancaster Bible from whatever it was 4 years ago get into the tournament necessarily when they played no shots, literally no one all season, right? I don't want to see that. So if you gave me the choice between the two, I would almost rather see this year's Rochester. But again, I think we have to have some sort of a balance. With this question, I also think we need to retire the phrase of so-called experts, right? Like we don't need to like take shots at the whoever we're talking about here was saying they're so-called experts. When it comes to Division III basketball, people are sharing their opinions, sharing their YouTube shows, doing whatever, their metrics, their numbers. They're just doing this like on a ad hoc volunteer for free. I'm interested in this stuff basis. So just because they have an opinion and they're on social media, it doesn't mean that they're a so-called expert. They maybe are an expert, or they may be not an expert, or they're just like a person. Like you can call me a so-called expert. I'm not an expert. I'm just a guy that has Microsoft Excel, and I turn the camera on and we record a YouTube show with you, Zach. So I think it's like we're trying to be pejorative here. We don't need to call people so-called experts. We can just say like people, or Zach said this and it was a bad opinion. Like that's fine. But I don't know. We just got to retire that phrase.
Yeah, and I think too, as people who have observed the system for a long time and put out predictions, we try to put out predictions based on what our understanding of the system, and we can help explain the system, but that should not be equated with defending the system. Right. I think we've been very open with, we have certain problems with the criteria, how it's defined, how it's implemented. Because the other thing to remember here is there's 5 primary criteria, but there's no prescribed weighting or importance within that. So if we feel like the committee this year was valuing SOS higher than in years past, that's for them to decide to do. There's no set way to say, it's 1/5, so therefore 20% of the importance is SOS. They have to evaluate the whole criteria, but there's no hierarchy or set weighting within that. Now, you also talk about, I think if you look at the primary criteria, I think that what it's trying to do is good, right? You want, first of all, winning percentage. You want teams that are winning games. That's good. SOS, you want to be looking at teams who have played good schedule, have won games and played good schedules, right? And then I think in terms of rankings and tournament selection, it's good to be looking at teams that have really good wins on their resume. And I believe that is what is trying to be ascertained through the results versus regionally ranked. Now, the problem is that, first of all, using regional rankings, you have to wait a week. It trails a week, right? Because it's always based. Well, we need to find out what are the regional rankings before we can say what your results versus regional rankings are. It also basically says by definition there are 7 good teams in Region 1. There are 6 good teams in Region 2. There are 7 good teams in so it creates these artificial lines at the bottom of the regional rankings where you're in or you're out, and it doesn't matter if you're a Region 7 team and you're technically 8th and you would have been ranked fourth in Region 5. That doesn't matter. We're treating, you're if you're in, you're out, and you're out. Now, as you mentioned, they do try to look into that and parse out, maybe better, maybe worse. But, if you're Worcester who beat Calvin, you're not getting credit for that, because after the first week, Calvin fell out of the rankings, even though they would have been ranked in plenty others. And so that's why it's been our idea. It's like, yeah, it's good to be looking for good wins on a resume, but let's rethink how we define or how we look for what is a good win. And if we just used a simple, RPI top 100 list, it doesn't matter what region you're in, or how many teams are in your region, or how many teams are in your regional rankings. If this 100 is the list, first of all, that list doesn't have to trail a week. It's just computational, and it's available. And so you can look at it right away from the beginning. You don't need to do an alphabetical set of rankings because you don't have all the data. And if you have a really deep region, where in Region 7, if your top 10 teams are as good as the top 5 in some other region, teams can get the same level of consideration. So when I look at the criteria, I think that they're trying to do the right thing, but in a lot of cases, not doing it the best way that could be. So I think that's important for all the stakeholders involved to try to stop and think, what is it we're trying to do? Okay, now how are we currently doing that? And is there a better way to accomplish what we're trying to do?
Yeah.
And if the answer to any of those, if the answer to that is yes, then let's move in the direction of implementing that better method.
All right. Well, that was the end of the mailbag.
Well, Matt, I'm looking forward to another great weekend of basketball. And with us having already planned a Fort Wayne trip, right from the start of the tournament, we're looking at, okay, who are those teams going to be there? But now we're down to the final 16, and we know by the end of next weekend we'll know what those 4 teams are. So it's always a little bit extra exciting to see, okay, who's actually going to be there in Fort Wayne that we're going to get to see in person. So happy viewing to all of D3 Hoops Nation out there. Be sure to connect with us on social media. We're on Twitter at we're on Twitter at D3 Datacast, and we're on Facebook at facebook.com/D3 Datacast, and right here on YouTube at youtube.com/@D3 Datacast. If you haven't subscribed by now, please consider clicking that subscribe button. And if you enjoyed this episode and our look at the tournament so far, give it a thumbs up.
This episode drops on Monday. That means 10 days until the first semifinal in Fort Wayne. But of course, before then, we've got those Sweet 16 Elite 8 matchups this weekend. Great games. I'm excited to talk to you about them next week, Zach. Until next time, good job, team.